Hello, everybody. This is Emery PB, and this is my game presentation for the final exam of Game Studies. Today, I'm going to be working on Final Fantasy VII, and I'm going to try to talk to you guys and explain a little bit about this game, the history, some of the ideas behind it. The marketing is a big one, why it's so great, memorable, some of the background of it, and then ultimately just why I think this game is so great, which is not to spoil too much already, but is because of the fact that it is able to, in my argument, let me just go ahead. I'll go ahead and get to that in a minute. But so, what is Final Fantasy VII? Well, Final Fantasy VII is a 1997 game released by Sony and Square Enix, or sorry, I guess actually at the time they were known as SquareSoft, but they would later merge with Enix Corporation in Japan. So Square Enix and SquareSoft is the same company, more or less. And pretty much immediately when it was released in Japan first, and then I think about half a year later, in the United States, it was met with instant love by critics, fans. Even though at the time we were just around getting like serious gaming, criticism and analysis. Uh, but it met with critical fan like just love. It met with sales, like massive sales. Like, to this day, they haven't sold anything quite as well as this game did. And yeah, it really revolutionized not just game mechanics. And I'm gonna be quite honest. I think as far as gameplay, game mechanics goes, that's probably the least revolutionary with this game. Like out of the three aspects, which is presentation, gameplay, and narrative, the gameplay is probably the least important as far as how it changed gaming, but the gameplay is still very fun and honestly really great. But we'll get into that in just a moment. But the reason why it's so important is because it really did, as you can see at the bottom, it helped to popularize the JRPG genre to Western audiences. And yeah, right here you can see images by Romulation. For some reason, images I was using weren't really able to show up, so most of these are actually released by Square Enix. If not, they will have an image at the bottom right, or an image to show you where they came from. But yeah, I actually, to be honest, ignore the text there on the left. Apologies, this is a bit strange the way it's been done. But essentially, there are a few ways that you can attack. In previous Final Fantasy games, you actually could have a party of up to 4 members, but for technical issues, they had to lower it down to 3. And a bunch of other stuff happened in it, but I won't get into that quite yet. But just basic gameplay, I really break it down a lot in this, but it's a turn-based RPG combat system. Each character has about 6 moves, technically 7, but it's attack, which is a physical attack. As you can see right here, we have Cloud, the main character of the game. He uses a sword. You can upgrade, or you don't upgrade, but you can essentially swap out what sword you're using throughout the game. You can buy new ones or find ones, and they have different effects, different damage. It's mostly just the damage number is bigger, to be honest. Barrett here has a machine gun arm, and then Tifa actually uses different types of fist or glove gauntlet kind of weapons. And yeah, and there's other characters you can get as well, of course. Like Vincent Valentine has a handgun, which can change into a shotgun or a rifle. Sid has a spear. And the interesting thing about those two is that this game did it pretty differently, where every few upgrades, the model of the weapon would change, so, like just slightly, sometimes substantially, but all their ultimate weapons have a unique model. And yeah, it was pretty great. But that's the physical attack. So then you go to magic right here below. And with magic, that's usually almost always is a ranged attack. And the thing with magic is that it's tied with materia, which is it's hard to go into. I'll go into in a moment. But materia comes from the life stream, which is the physical blood stream, basically, of the planet that they live on. I think it's Gaia is the name of the planet. But anyways, it comes from that, and you can swap them between party members, which allows you to use different magic types and magic attacks. And a lot of the times they do damage. Like there's a fire or Firaga attack, which just shoots fire. There's an Era attack that just shoots air, things like that. But there are some called slow, which doesn't do any damage, but it slows down the enemy's turn. And the interesting thing about this is that Final Fantasy IV was actually the first RPG to use a system that is called ATB. It stands for Active Time Battle. But once again, Final Fantasy VII really made it famous, and Final Fantasy V was actually the first one to have a meter at the bottom to show you when it was your turn or the enemy's turn. Or just your turn. You never actually got to see what the enemy's turn was. But The interesting thing about that, though, is that with that you could use moves like slow to slow down the enemy's attack. So they'll attack no matter what. You only attack once you select for you to attack. And yeah, you individually control each party member. And if you see right here, this will control the order of characters. I forget the exact order off the top of my head, but either the top or the bottom one means that you're at the front. I think it's actually, yeah, the top one means that you're at the front, and that won't affect necessarily your timing of the attacks, but it will affect what order you do. So at the front, or sorry, what damage numbers you do. So at the front, you will give out the most damage, but you'll take the most damage. The middle will do about the same, about the middle of it, but then the bottom one will do the least damage, but take the least as well. So usually you want your glass cannon characters to be back there, or say if you got a character up front like Cloud, who in my playthrough had very high defense. He had very high defense and very high attack, so of course I put him at the front. It just made sense, but he didn't have very good magic. But yeah, magic can do effects like that. Then we have summon, which has been a staple for Final Fantasy since I believe also 4. But summon essentially is like a magic attack, except it's I won't even say. Usually I would say it's a high risk, high reward, but it's just a high reward, high use move. So whenever you use magic or summon, you use up MP, as you can see right here. MP is basically magic points, just as health points. If your health points are reduced to 0, your character dies, and if all 3 characters die, you lose, game over. If MP is reduced to 0, nothing really happens, you just can't use magic anymore. And then, but the summons, essentially, as you can tell, it summons in a giant creature or entity of some sort. Usually they are already existing characters or other summons from previous games, such as Bahamut or Rama, Titan, Leviathan, so on and so forth. Some of them are original, like the Phoenix is in this one as well. But I won't go into that. Or Knights of the Round is another one. That's the most infamous one, which the entire animation from beginning to end was a minute and 15 seconds, which for the time was absolutely insane that anyone would ever put that in a PS1 game. But anyways, summons do that, but they take up a lot of damage and time. And sometimes they're not really, honestly, useful to have. Especially when you get to super bosses later. There's one the very end of the game that was added in the American version that we got called Emerald Weapon, where you have a time limit to defeat the enemy of 15 minutes, and it doesn't pause at any point, even if you have long attack animations. And just the attack per second damage is not worth it, essentially. Item down here is just like magic, honestly, except they are one-time use items that you can sometimes buy at a store. Sometimes they're finite completely. There's only a certain amount. You can't buy them infinitely. Sometimes they're just ones you find. Sometimes it's a weapon. Like, say, Tifa here, as you can tell, doesn't have any ranged attacks, so she couldn't, with some enemies, if, say, there's a gap in between and you can't get to them, she would use a weapon called, machine gun, or an item, called machine gun, where she just gets to use it for once, but it doesn't do a lot of damage, essentially, so... Yeah, and then you can change the order of characters. You can do a block, which is just defends yourself, and then you can do escape. However, sorry, I keep pressing that by mistake. However, if your character accrues enough damage, as you can see here with the limit attack, or the limit meter, they will keep building up as they take damage. However, if they die, the limit goes to 0. Right? Now, here's the other thing, though, is that if once this limit fills up to the top, your attack is replaced by Limit Break, which is a really crazy attack that the player can use on the enemy. And they keep it even between battles until they either use it or they die. And there's actually a narrative. This is one of the best narrative pieces of a tie between a game and its narrative, or its mechanics and its narrative. And I'll get to that in a little bit when I discuss the story a bit more. But the Limit Break, there's 4 levels, and each one can be upgraded actually further. There's 4 types, and then each one has about 3 or 4 levels, depending on which one. And they can go from, let's say Cloud, for instance. He's got one which he shoots a beam of light a beam of air at the enemy. He's got one where he summons in meteorites that fall down on a group of enemies. He's got one which does physical damage to one enemy, and he's got another one which does physical damage to multiple enemies. It's pretty great, honestly, the way that it works. And it's a really fun system that I really genuinely enjoy a lot. And it's great, too, if you have one where I need this for a boss, but you kind of have to go, okay, well, do I want to keep taking damage and use it now and waste it? Or, but then if I don't use it, if I hold on to it and don't waste it, I can't use the physical attack of this character until I do. And it's a risk reward kind of thing where sometimes it's really beneficial. Like say you come up with a boss fight, you're going to want to do that damage, but otherwise, you might not want it. So it can become kind of an interesting conflict there. But moving on to the story. So, Final Fantasy VII really did pioneer a lot of things for game narratives. You have things like plot twists, unreliable narrators, death of playable characters. You've got a lot of religious and literature references of outside works, pop culture references, and it was really great with all of them. But the thing is, I mean, none of them were really, what's the word per se, completely unique or only done for the first time in a video game in this game. But it was the game that once again really pioneered for a wider audience. Nobody really saw it until later. Nobody really saw these things until Final Fantasy VII came along. And the reason why I think it's so good, this game's narrative, is for one, it has a lot of themes. It's got pro-environment, anti-corporation themes. It's got stuff about how people can grow from their trauma and move on. It has also just really fun and entertaining characters that, they were actually designed specifically to break your expectations of what they would be. The character Cloud shows up as just a cool, silent, badass kind of guy. But then once you start playing through that story, you start to notice that he's not as cool as he thought he was. He's actually got some pretty bad identity issues. And yeah, it really did great in doing all of that together. And yeah, and once again, I won't go into it too much. Once again, but there's sorry, I'll go into it a bit later. But pre-rendered cutscenes were a major part of this game, and they really stick in people's mind. Right here I have probably the most famous one ever. At least it's one of my favorite ones from the game, and it's one of the best visuals in the game ever. This is the main villain of the game, Sephiroth, burning down the main character Cloud's village in Nibelheim when he was a child. This is just genuinely one of the best scenes in the game, but it really stuck out to a lot of people's heads, and it's one of the most memorable ones for a reason. You have the synthesis, and this is what I think is so interesting about this game, is that I didn't really go into the narrative just because it's about, if you do all the side content or most of it, it can be about a 70-hour game, and I don't want to go into all of that. We don't have time. I don't want to waste your time. I don't want to spoil it in case people haven't played it. But I will say you definitely should play this game. There's a remake, of course, but that's a different beast in its own, and I'll go into that a little bit later as well. But Final Fantasy VII, I think, is really great because of the fact that it's able to mix together these elements of gameplay and narrative to an expert degree. Once again, the gameplay itself, the mechanics, weren't all that changed from Final Fantasy VI or even other just contemporary RPGs at the time. But it was so good because it mixed them together. The limit break system, I think, is great because it rewards the player for not dying through combat, but actually for surviving death. This is really important because there's a great article that I actually will be linking in the essay version of this. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find it here. But it's a great article about how all the characters of Final Fantasy VII have actually been survivors of death and trauma. And I think that that's a beautiful way of linking it together into the mechanics of the game. The characters are rewarded not for dying. In fact, they are penalized for dying and coming back, but they're rewarded for surviving it. Once again, I won't go into all of that. I really recommend, there's actually a video version of the essay uploaded by a channel called Resonant Arc. And I really do recommend everybody go check that video out. They go into a lot more detail on each individual character. It's a really beautifully done video, and that's why I think Final Fantasy VII, though, is so great, is that they emphasize each of these moments with stuff like mini-games. Like, there's a climactic sequence. After about the 10-hour point of the game, you're leaving the first act of it, and they have a climactic motorcycle chase sequence that is independently programmed just for that point of the game that you never get to see again. You never get to play that again. But it puts in your head, man, that was a really cool moment. I really felt like I was running for my life from the man in the city. And you did. It's so well done, and I really think it's just beautifully done. And once again, they also emphasize lots of scenes with, at the time, very brief but also very expensive, and at the time, once again, beautifully done cutscenes. And I just think that this is my main thing about this game. But going into it at the time, RPGs, like I said, were not popular in America. They were pretty popular in Japan, especially down here. You're looking at the Dragon Quest series. This series only recently, I would say, actually got popular in the West with Dragon Quest XI on the Switch. go, or the PS4 and the Switch and the 3DS as well. Go play that game. Really is great. Don't want to go into it though. But at the time on the PS1, the biggest games you were getting were sports games. Gran Turismo 1 and 2 were the first and third most popular highest selling games on the PlayStation 1 respectively. You just got games like that most. So you got some shooters, but once again, not a ton. You were just starting to get more niche titles like Resident Evil and then later Silent Hill on the system. And then of course, I will be honest though, there were some American games that were RPGs, but they were very rare. Like the Ultima series is a great example, which actually did inspire the original Final Fantasy game, as well as the original Dragon Quest. But once again, RPGs weren't really a big thing in America. In fact, Final Fantasies in Japan, the games were Final Fantasies 1, 4, and 6 were released in America as 1, 2, 3, once again, respectively. And it was a mess. The games were neutered, they were censored, they were altered, and they didn't really hold a lot of the original tone and feel of the games. But, they did come out. And this is, once again, just to point out the success of Final Fantasy VII. It popularized a genre of video game in the West. Here's the development team. I'm not going to go into it too crazy detailed, but this photo up here is actually a photo of the Final Fantasy VII development team. This one down here is actually for Final Fantasy IV. But these two pictures together were just good at getting all the key members that I could. Of course, you have the director of this game is Yoshinori Kitase, who you can actually see in this photo here looking very angry for some reason. Kitase and Sakaguchi, as well as Nomura here, have all been very prominent figures at Square and Square Enix since the time. Hironobu Sakaguchi right here is actually the creator of the Final Fantasy series and did leave at a point to form his own studio. We have Nobuo Uematsu, who is, for me, the best video game composer that the industry's ever had. I think he's genius, wonderful guy. Then down here we have Nomura, who started work on 4, and with each title up until 7, he got more and more prominent in the game's creations, until he got to 7, where he was, as you can see, not only a writer in the game, but also the character, monster, mech artist. And as far as you can go, Fuji is this individual right here and here. He was the main battle planner. I think his work is really undermined in a lot of this, and I think that's partially because there is so many people to credit in these games, as well as with Narita here, who I apologize. Actually, this image, this one and this one is Fuji. This one and this one is Narita, to my knowledge. Or maybe I actually do have that swapped. These two, and then these two are the same. But anyways, there's a really big team of people, and these guys are pretty consistent for the most part, really, in each game from 4 to 6 and so on. And yeah, they're really, really talented dudes. But some of the trials that came through this game, right here is a prototype for Final Fantasy VII that was made using a generic boss from Final Fantasy VI with characters. For one thing, they moved over from Nintendo to Sony. Previously, they'd only put the games out on Nintendo platforms, but upon hearing that Nintendo was going to stay with cartridges for the N64 and not move to disk systems, Sony said, Square Software said, we can't do that because this demo alone was ridiculously expensive, almost as expensive as Final Fantasy VI itself. And they had been in talks with Nintendo saying, we're gonna upgrade to a disc system for the next game. We're gonna do that. And then Nintendo didn't, and Squaresoft, understandably felt pretty betrayed and decided to go work with Sony, who was developing their brand new PlayStation. This ended up being a pretty big loss for Nintendo. Arguably, had they stuck with cartridges, maybe Final Fantasy VII, or almost certainly wouldn't have been the game we know it is now. And yeah, like I said earlier, Final Fantasies 1, 4, and 6 were known as 1, 2, 3 in America. But when this game released, it was just called Final Fantasy VII. Square didn't want to have to argue with changing the names and taking out religious symbolism in names. They just said, whatever, we're just going to go as if the series has been there the whole time. And then after the fact, re-released older games. Here's the biggest part of the game, is the marketing. The marketing for this game was insane. There were tons of TV ads. All of these are magazine covers, which are very dated and, in my opinion, very stupid, but memorable. And they were really pushing the fact that, if you notice here, there is no in-game screenshots. These are all screenshots from pre-rendered cutscenes. Or this one's not even in a cutscene. This one's just a piece of art from the game. It's not even you don't even see this in the game proper. And yeah, this, as you can see, they're really pointing out the fact that coming to a screen near you, is your TV screen big enough? This one actually makes fun of Nintendo for still making cartridges instead of discs. Very petty, very dumb, but this really revolutionized video game marketing, and Square Enix up until the mid 2000s pretty much just stuck with this. They never showed in-game footage. They just showed CGI cutscenes. But regardless, they were very, very memorable. And right here, too, I want to point out, too, version that Americans got was the international version. It was just called Final Fantasy VII. But we got extra bosses, extra cutscenes, bug fixes, and some new animations and weapons and side quests. And that's pretty much all you need to know about that. And yeah, once again, Final Fantasy VII really did bring in countless new fans. It really revolutionized the series for old fans, both Japanese and American. It was a jump from classic medieval, somewhat scientific series to a full-on sci-fi with medieval aspects. It was a flip, and it was really crazy for that. I think it's one of the most interesting worlds that the series has ever had. And yeah, it's really well beloved by pretty much everyone who's played it, at least when it came out. Legacy of the Sales, once again, I keep saying it, but it really popularized the genre in America. It's the highest selling Final Fantasy game by a pretty big margin, but also it is the second highest selling PlayStation 1 game of all time, only followed by Gran Turismo 1. Or only surpassed by Gran Turismo 1. And yeah, like I just said, very popular in Japan too. It's widely considered to be the best game in the series by them to this day, or by the general consensus of the Japanese Final Fantasy fans. And yeah, once again, Final Fantasy is doing well, but so is just Final Fantasy VII. There has been the original title, there has been a movie adaptation, or a movie sequel, a prequel. A phone exclusive prequel, a PSP prequel, a PS2 sequel, a remake that is actually a sequel in subtext, and just a ton of other just crap. Most of them, in my opinion, aren't quite as good as the original game. Oh, and there's also, I forgot to include, there's a PC remaster version from 1997, 2004, actually, not 1997. 2004, which upgraded the models of the characters, allowed modding, and changed the music to not, or quote unquote upgraded the music. It's kind of worse in my opinion, but oh well. Anyways, the Final Fantasy VII series is, for a lot of people, arguably more popular than the Final Fantasy brand in general. But yeah. And then the legacy of how it changed video games. I mean, as you can see here, Final Fantasy VII pretty much just changed how Final Fantasy games would be for a while, and inspired the Kingdom Hearts series, which is basically was created as a crossover, saying, well, what if we put Final Fantasy and Disney together? Don't ask. It's popular. This is one of the best box arts ever made for a video game. I don't care what you say. It also inspired just darker storytelling in general, with games like Drakengard, which would later turn into the Nier series of games, which is very popular now, at least compared to what it used to be. It really popularized more edgy, kind of darker storytelling, even though that's not really what the game was. It also inspired, other games too, like Persona 2, Innocent Sin, and just the SMT series as a whole really started using more religious symbolism but focusing more on character aspects, in like troubled characters rather than just, we gotta go stop the bad guy. And of course, it made video game movies very popular. Final Fantasy VII's success led to Final Fantasy Spirits Within, which is a terrible film, but, whatever. And yeah, I won't go into most of these just because that would be a rabbit hole in its own right. Here's some of my citations, and thank you guys for watching. You guys have a wonderful day. Thank you for giving me your time, and I hope that you learned something. And you guys really, once again, if you haven't played this game, I really recommend going out and giving it a look. You guys have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Goodbye.